At 9:14 on a Thursday night, my father told me not to come to the company holiday dinner unless I was prepared to act like family again. I said, understood. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the shared compliance folders I had been maintaining for 4 years, and started removing my personal credentials from every document, renewal tracker, vendor registry, and licensing file that had my name attached to it. I did not delete anything. I did not damage anything. I documented the time, exported the active logs, sent written notice to the outside counsel I trusted, and withdrew from every process I had been privately holding together for people who liked using my work much more than they liked acknowledging me. By the next morning, everything they had been hiding behind was visible. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 35 years old, and I worked in regulatory documentation for medical facilities. If you're listening, tell me where you're watching from. One word for this story is paper. People hear paperwork and think filing cabinets, routine, something boring that anyone could do if they had enough patience. That misunderstanding helped my family for years. They dismissed my work in public because it sounded small. Then they used it in private because they knew exactly how much could go wrong without it. My father, Warren, owned a regional chain of outpatient imaging centers across western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. Not huge, not national, but large enough that the business looked impressive from the outside. 3 facilities when I was in college, 5 by the time I turned 31, 7 when everything finally came apart. The family story was simple. My father was the builder. My younger brother, Cole, was the future. My stepmother, Denise, handled public relationships, charity events, and all the polished language that made unstable operations look established. And I was, depending on who was speaking, either great with details or too serious to relax. At the dinner table, my father would introduce Cole as the one with instincts. He would introduce me as the one who likes forms. People laughed when he said that. Then 2 days later, one of those same people would call me privately because a facility enrollment packet was incomplete, an insurance credentialing renewal had the wrong effective date, or a state inspection response needed to be written in language precise enough not to trigger a second review. That pattern started early. I was 17 the first time my father handed me a stack of disorganized records and said, "You're the only one around here who reads everything." He meant it as a compliment. In our family, that was close enough to affection that I accepted it. Back then, it really was small things. Vendor agreements, employee vaccination records, equipment maintenance logs, a missed signature on a lease addendum. My father hated administrative work, and Cole treated it like an insult to his intelligence. So when something needed to be checked, compared, or explained in plain English, it landed with me. I got used to being useful before I got used to being respected. That becomes dangerous if you let it go on too long. After college, I did not go into the family business. That part matters. I built an actual career first. I worked for a healthcare compliance consulting group in Asheville. I learned credentialing systems, audit response language, privacy training records, licensing calendars, chain of custody documentation, incident reporting, vendor review. I learned how one missing date or careless statement could create months of expensive consequences. I learned how people who hate documentation usually hate it because documentation remembers what they said. By 29, I had a stable job, decent benefits, and the kind of professional reputation that came from being careful in a field where careful people save everyone else from embarrassment. That was when my father started leaning harder. At first, it sounded temporary. "Mara, can you glance at this one renewal packet? Mara, can you tell me why this payer enrollment got kicked back? Mara, can you look over a site response before we send it?" Then it became ongoing. He asked if I could help just until they hired the right office manager. Then the office manager quit. Then the next one lasted 5 months. Then the central administrator left with 2 days' notice. Then suddenly there was a family understanding that I was the one person who could keep things moving quietly until a better solution appeared. It never appeared. Instead, I became the invisible bridge between what the business claimed to be and what it actually had in place. My father never put me on the leadership page of the website. He never listed me in press releases. He never mentioned my work when donors, physicians, or referral partners were around. But my email address was copied on everything serious. By the time I was 33, I was doing my real job 40 to 45 hours a week and then spending another 12 to 18 hours cleaning up my father's systems at night and on weekends. I tracked facility license renewals in 3 counties. I corrected insurance participation files before recredentialing lapses. I rewrote policy manuals that had been copied from outdated templates. I documented staff training completions because half the managers forgot to store proof. I handled formal response drafts whenever an outside reviewer flagged missing records. I was never called director. I was never called consultant. I was definitely never paid like either one. When I asked once, carefully, whether we should formalize the arrangement, my father smiled and said, "Why make this corporate? Your family." That sentence did more damage in my life than any insult ever did. Because family, in our house, was the word used when they wanted professional labor without professional terms. Cole benefited from that more than anyone. He was 4 years younger than me and had my father's confidence without any of his stamina. He wore expensive quarter zips, showed up late, spoke in broad claims, and had a habit of making half-finished ideas sound strategic. He was always about to turn things around, always on the edge of a major referral partnership, always one relationship away from a breakthrough. When something went wrong under his watch, it landed on my phone. I still remember a Tuesday in March 2023. I was leaving my office at 6:08 p.m. when Cole called and said one of the centers had a site visit in 2 days and some stuff in the credentialing binder might be out of order. Some stuff. I drove there after work. The binder was missing current provider rosters, 2 annual attestations, and a complete equipment service verification section. The incident reporting log had not been updated in 4 months. Someone had backdated a training acknowledgement in a way that was obvious to anyone with eyes. I sat at the reception desk until 11:46 p.m. rebuilding the file from email chains and scanned records. Cole brought me a vending machine coffee around 9 and said, "You always make this look easy." No thank you. No apology. No recognition that I was there because he had treated regulated operations like optional homework. That was the family pattern in one sentence. They called me rigid when nothing was wrong and dependable when everything was. Denise was subtler, but not better. She never asked for help directly. She framed things socially. Your father is under so much pressure. You know how much this dinner means to him. It would help everyone if the records looked cleaner before investors toured the Asheville site. She loved the phrase "looked cleaner." Not were cleaner. Looked cleaner. If I corrected her, she would laugh lightly and call me exacting, as if accuracy were a personality quirk rather than the reason no one had been fined yet. The public disrespect was steady and small, which is often how it survives so long. At a charity golf event in September 2024, someone asked Denise what I did, and before I could answer, she said, "Mara handles odds and ends. She's the organized one." Odds and ends. 3 hours earlier, I had reviewed a 17-page corrective action response tied to one of their facilities. At Thanksgiving that same year, my father gave a toast about the next generation and named Cole twice. He called him bold, called him natural, called him the one who understood expansion. Then he looked at me and said, "Mara keeps us out of the weeds." Everyone laughed like that was praise. I smiled because I had been doing that my whole life. But I noticed something at that table. My father was getting careless. He believed the system would keep holding because I always made it hold. Cole believed his title mattered more than the work underneath it. Denise believed presentation could carry structure indefinitely. And all 3 of them had started speaking as if my help was not help at all, but an inherited family utility they were entitled to. Around that same time, I started keeping better records for myself. Nothing dramatic. I saved emails. I archived text messages. I created a private timeline document. I noted dates, requested tasks, missing signatures, approval gaps, reimbursement delays, and instances where my name had been copied onto official material without clear authorization language. I did it because I had spent too many years in compliance not understanding what happens when informal arrangements meet formal exposure. And I did it because of one person outside my family. Her name was Lydia Chin. She was 58, steady, unflashy, and one of the best healthcare attorneys I have ever met. We worked together on a client matter in 2022, and over time, she became the person I called when I needed reality instead of family language. I never dumped my whole life on her. I am not built that way, but I would ask narrow questions. If someone drafts policy responses under personal credentials for a private business, what exposure matters most? If internal files use an employee's professional language without formal role definition, where does responsibility actually sit? If someone wants to step back, what has to be documented first? Lydia never dramatized anything. That is why I trusted her. She would answer carefully, then usually say some version of the same thing. Clarity early is cheaper than cleanup later. By December 2025, I knew I needed clarity. Not because of one fight, because the pressure had become systematic. There had been 7 months of problems stacked on each other. A lease certification packet submitted with outdated ownership language. A manager onboarding file with missing attestations. A payer revalidation issue that required a written explanation. A facility policy manual that still referenced a medical director who had retired the previous spring. A vendor screening form signed by Cole without supporting review notes. 3 separate instances where I was introduced informally as basically our compliance person, while still being excluded from compensation discussions. Then came the project that broke something in me. My father wanted to refinance 2 properties tied to the business and consolidate some operating obligations under a cleaner lending structure before year-end. He said it was standard growth housekeeping. It was not. It was a strained business trying to look stable enough for better terms. To get there, they needed clean records, current compliance representations, updated facility documentation, and consistent explanations across legal, operational, and licensing files. In other words, they needed the exact type of invisible work they had spent years minimizing. I told him, in writing on November 18, 2025, that if he wanted me involved at that level, the arrangement needed to be formalized. Defined scope, written authority, compensation, clear separation from my outside employment. I wrote it in polite language. I read it once, then again, before sending. He responded 47 minutes later. Don't make this weird. We're family and this is a temporary push. Temporary. Again. I let it sit overnight before answering. Then I wrote back that I would assist only on document cleanup already in progress and would not represent myself as internal compliance leadership for any lender, broker, or reviewer. He called me 3 times that evening. I did not answer. At 9:22 p.m., he texted, "You are overthinking this." That sentence told me more than anything else he could have said. People who intend to protect you do not get irritated when you ask for definitions. Still, I helped more than I should have. That is part of the truth, too. I was not trapped every second. Sometimes I chose the easier path because I thought one clean week might finally reduce the chaos. Sometimes I helped because I remembered who my father had been before image mattered more to him than honesty. Sometimes I helped because if a filing failed or a license slipped, real staff at those facilities would live with the mess first. That is how families like mine keep you in place. They lace obligation with decency until leaving feels like abandoning innocent people, even when the people exploiting you are not innocent at all. The holiday dinner was held at a private room in Greenville on December 11th. My father liked that restaurant because the lighting was flattering and the parking was easy for local business owners who might happen to stop by. That is the kind of detail you notice when someone is always performing prosperity a little harder than necessary. I had not wanted to go, but Denise called 2 days before and said, "Please just come and make it smooth." Make it smooth. That phrase again. My role reduced to friction management. So I went. Cocktail hours started at 6:30. I arrived at 6:42. I documented that time later because it mattered more than I knew. Cole was already there laughing with 2 equipment vendors and a lender my father had been trying to impress for months. Denise wore a dark blue dress and moved through the room like she was hosting a magazine feature. My father stood near the bar telling a story about expansion. At 7:18, I heard my own name and turned just in time to catch the end of an introduction. "This is my daughter Mara," my father said to the lender. "She likes to sanity check our files when she gets anxious. Likes to sanity check our files when she gets anxious." I stood there, looked at the lender, then at my father, and felt something inside me settle in a way it had not before. Not flare, not break. Settle, because I knew what that sentence did. It turned years of technical work into nervous fussing. It made my professional involvement sound personal and optional. It gave him the benefit of my labor while stripping it of credibility in front of the exact kind of witness who mattered. I did not correct him there. I just said, "Nice to meet you," and stepped away. Dinner was served at 8:03. Speeches started at 8:41. Cole got thanked for vision. Denise got thanked for loyalty. I got thanked, eventually, for being willing to jump in when details become details. There are moments when humiliation is loud. This was not one of them. It was worse. It was polished enough that anyone outside the family could mistake it for affection. But I knew the structure by then. Public minimization. Private dependence. No title. No clarity. Maximum usefulness. At 9:06, I went to the restroom, stood at the sink, and looked at myself until my breathing leveled. Then I texted Lydia. "Need to withdraw cleanly tonight. Available?" She responded at 9:09. "Yes. Document first. Call when you leave." At 9:14, my father cornered me near the hallway outside the dining room. He had that tight smile he used when he wanted obedience without witnesses. He said I had embarrassed him by standing stiff during the introduction earlier, and that if I was going to bring tension into the room, I should not come back in after the break unless I was prepared to act like family again. I looked at him for a second and realized he had finally made the decision for me. I said, understood. Then I picked up my coat, left through the side entrance, sat in my car, and called Lydia at 9:21 p.m. I documented the time. That call lasted 14 minutes. She told me exactly what I already knew and exactly what I needed to hear. Do not threaten. Do not argue verbally. Do not leave gaps. Withdraw from all unofficial support in writing. Notify relevant external parties only as needed to clarify your non-role. Preserve every record. I drove home, changed clothes, opened my laptop at 10:03 p.m., and began. By 10:17, I had created time-stamped exports of the renewal trackers I maintained. By 10:41, I had removed my personal contact line from internal draft headers they kept reusing. By 11:06, I sent written notice to my father, copied to Denise and Cole, that effective immediately I was no longer providing informal regulatory, documentation, credentialing, audit response, or licensing support to any Ellison imaging entity without a formal written agreement executed after independent review. At 11:19, I sent a narrower clarification to 2 outside contacts whose systems still listed me as a documentation point of contact, stating that I was not an employee, officer, or authorized compliance representative for the business and should not be listed going forward. At 11:43, I saved all delivery confirmations into a separate folder labeled withdrawal record. No anger, no speeches, just facts. At 12:08 a.m., my father replied with one line, "You are choosing a strange time to be difficult." I did not answer. At 12:26, Cole sent, "Can we not make this dramatic?" I did not answer that either. At 12:51, Denise emailed, "I think everyone is tired and this can be discussed tomorrow." That one almost made me smile, because tomorrow was exactly what they were afraid of without admitting it. I shut my laptop at 1:04 a.m. and went to sleep. At 6:37 the next morning, my phone started vibrating. 3 missed calls from Cole, 2 from Denise, 1 from the Asheville site manager, then a voicemail from a lender's office asking for confirmation of a compliance role description previously referenced in discussion. I sat up in bed, listened to it once, then again. That silence afterward told me more than the message itself. My name had still been used after I withdrew, and by the next morning, everything they had been hiding behind was visible. I did not call my family back first. I made coffee, opened my laptop at 6:52 a.m., and started with the lender voicemail because that was the detail that mattered most. Family panic can wait. Outside reliance cannot. The message had been left at 6:41 by an associate named Daniel Mercer from a commercial lending group in Charlotte. He said they were finalizing background support notes for a refinancing package and needed to confirm whether I was still serving in a compliance and documentation oversight capacity for Ellison Imaging Holdings. Still serving. That phrasing told me two things immediately. First, my name had been used in active discussions, not just internally. Second, it had been used as if my role were ongoing and understood, which made the entire arrangement more dangerous than even I had assumed. At 7:03, I replied in writing. I kept it short. I always do when facts are enough. I stated that I had never held a formal executive, officer, or employee compliance role with Ellison Imaging Holdings. I stated that any prior informal assistance I had provided was withdrawn effective 11:06 p.m. the previous night. I stated that no lender, broker, or third party should rely on my name, credentials, or prior document support as evidence of present role authority, operational oversight, or continuing responsibility. Then I read it once, then again, and sent it. At 7:11, Daniel replied asking if I was available for a quick clarifying call. I said yes, but only if counsel was copied on the scheduling email. By then my phone had logged 14 missed calls. 9 from family, 3 from business numbers I recognized, 2 from numbers I didn't. I documented all of them. That is one thing people misunderstand about calm women. They think calm means passive. It does not. Sometimes it means every part of you has become precise. At 7:26, Cole finally texted something more honest than anything he had written the night before. What exactly did you tell people? I answered at 7:29. The truth. No explanation after that. No argument. Just a word. He called immediately. I let it ring. Then my father called. Then Denise. Then Cole again. At 7:41, Lydia emailed back confirming she could join a 9 a.m. call if needed and asked one question. Have any third parties implied your name was included in current operating representations? I copied Daniel's message to her and answered yes. She sent back 6 words. Then keep everything in writing first. I did. By 8:04, the Asheville site manager, Paula, emailed me directly. Paula had worked at one of my father's facilities for 6 years. She was tired in the way competent people get when they've spent too long absorbing mess created by confident people. Her note was careful. Mara, I was told you may not be handling the licensing update package anymore. We have a reviewer asking follow-up questions on the training record discrepancies. Please advise who should be sending the response. Please advise who should be sending the response. I stared at that line for a moment because it captured my exact position in the family system. Even after I left, the first instinct inside the business was still to route structure through me. At 8:10, I responded that I was no longer acting in any compliance, documentation, or licensing support capacity for any Ellison Imaging entity, and that all future questions needed to be directed to authorized internal management. I copied my father, Cole, and the general operations inbox. Then I created a separate note to myself. 8:10 a.m. Internal staff still routing regulatory questions to me after written withdrawal. That detail mattered, not emotionally, factually. At 8:22, Lydia called. I put her on speaker and took notes while she talked, because that is how I function when something matters. She told me what exposure I needed to think about first, not whether my family felt betrayed, not whether the dinner had been unfair, not whether Cole sounded stressed. Those things were irrelevant compared to this. If my name had been presented to lenders, site contacts, or reviewers as part of active oversight after my withdrawal, then the issue was no longer just family exploitation. It was misrepresentation risk. She said very clearly, Mara, your usefulness to them may have crossed into unauthorized reliance. I wrote that down exactly. Then she asked me to walk through everything my work had actually been covering, not in family language, in professional language. So I did. I told her about the facility licensing calendar I maintained across multiple counties. I told her about the provider credentialing rosters I kept current because enrollment lapses could interrupt billing eligibility. I told her about the annual training logs, corrective action drafts, payer revalidation summaries, policy document revisions, and document trails I had been quietly standardizing for 4 years. I told her which spreadsheets had my naming conventions, which response letters contained my language, which third-party contacts had been routed through me informally, and which site managers defaulted to me when they needed to know what version of a document was current. When I finished, Lydia was silent for a second. Then she said, "You were not helping with odds and ends. You were acting as a shadow control layer." That was the first time anyone had said it so plainly. And once I heard it in those words, I could not unhear it. A shadow control layer. Not acknowledged enough to be protected, not compensated enough to be proper, but essential enough that the system had learned to lean on me as if I were load-bearing infrastructure. That morning, between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, I started seeing my own life more clearly than I had in years. Because families like mine train you to describe your labor in soft language, just checking a few files, just helping with responses, just smoothing something over, just taking a look. But when Lydia asked what happened if I stopped doing those things, the answer was obvious. Deadlines would be missed, contradictions would surface, people would realize there was no stable internal process underneath the polished language, and most importantly, outsiders would start asking who had actually been maintaining operational credibility all this time. At 9:02, Daniel from the lender group joined a conference call with Lydia copied in. His tone was polite but different from the voicemail, more careful, more formal. He explained that during preliminary financing review, Ellison Imaging had described document governance and renewal tracking as being under support from Family Side Compliance Administration, with my name referenced as a stabilizing factor. He asked whether that characterization was still accurate. I let him finish before answering. Then I said, No, I was not now or previously an internal compliance officer. No, I was not an employee of the holding entity. No, I had provided limited, informal documentation support historically, but any such support had been unofficial and had ended as of the prior evening. No, my name should not be used to imply present authority, internal controls, or ongoing oversight. Daniel thanked me in the very neutral voice professionals use when they are suddenly reconsidering the reliability of an entire deal. Then, Lydia asked the question I had been too close to frame myself. Can you clarify whether Miss Ellison's name was included in representations already shared with underwriting or only discussed verbally? There was a pause. That silence told me more than his answer. Finally, he said, "Some role descriptions appear in internal summaries provided to the deal team. We are reviewing scope now." Internal summaries provided to the deal team. In other words, I had not just been mentioned casually at a dinner or dropped in conversation. My existence had been translated into transaction language. That mattered. After the call ended, I documented everything I could remember from it while it was still fresh. 9:02 a.m., lender clarifying call, role described as Family Side Compliance Administration, name referenced as stabilizing factor, internal summaries provided to deal team, scope under review after correction. Then I saved the note into the same folder as my withdrawal records. By 9:37, my father finally sent an email instead of calling. The subject line was, "Need to correct misunderstanding." I opened it, read it once, then again. He wrote that the family had only described me as someone familiar with documentation standards, and that if lenders had overinterpreted my involvement, that could be fixed easily without turning this into a legal issue. That phrase is important. Without turning this into a legal issue. People only write that when they are already picturing one. I forwarded the message to Lydia without comment. She replied 11 minutes later. Do not editorialize, just preserve. So I preserved. Then came the flood from inside the business. At 10:06, a site administrator called to ask if I had a current copy of a radiation equipment maintenance index because Cole thought you were still finalizing it. At 10:18, someone from billing emailed asking where the updated provider effective date sheet was stored. At 10:27, Denise texted, "You are scaring people unnecessarily." At 10:44, my father wrote again, this time asking me to simply clarify to outsiders that you remain available to the family during transition. Transition. That was another word my family liked when they wanted permanent help dressed up as temporary courtesy. I did not say yes. I answered at 10:51 with one paragraph. I stated that I was not available to serve in any ongoing, transitional, unofficial, or advisory documentation role for Ellison imaging entities without a formal engagement reviewed independently. I further stated that my name should not be used in any communication suggesting current participation, availability, or operational support. Then, I stopped checking my father's messages for an hour and focused on something I should have done a year earlier. I mapped out exactly what I had been holding together. I opened a blank document and started listing functions, systems, dates, and dependencies, not feelings, structures, licensing calendar maintenance, provider roster verification, insurance participation follow-up, training completion records, incident log formatting, policy version control, corrective action response drafting, external document request coordination, vendor registry cleanup, site inspection binder assembly, enrollment packet consistency checks, archived document retrieval. Next to each one, I wrote 3 things: what I had been doing, how often I had been doing it, and what would likely happen if no one replaced it. The list was longer than I expected. By 12:13 p.m., it was 6 pages. I sat back in my chair and looked at it for a long time. Because that document explained my life more honestly than any family conversation ever had. I had not been the anxious daughter who liked forms. I had not been over-involved. I had not been difficult. I had been functioning as unpaid operational continuity for a growing healthcare business run by people who liked the appearance of systems more than the discipline of building them. That afternoon, the family story changed tone. The morning had been annoyance. By early afternoon, it became concern. By 2:00, it became panic dressed as reconciliation. Denise called first and left a voicemail in her softest voice. "Mara, I think there's been a tone problem on all sides. Your father is just under pressure. Nobody meant to diminish you." Tone problem. Not misuse, not unauthorized reliance, not years of private dependence and public reduction. Tone. At 2:16, Cole texted, "This is hurting more people than you think." That one was almost interesting, because it was probably true. Staff would be affected. Timelines would shift. Managers who had quietly depended on my corrections would suddenly discover how much I had been absorbing. But that was exactly the point. The system had been built around invisible labor and informal rescue. If my leaving hurt, that was not proof I should have stayed. It was proof the structure was real. At 2:41, my father left the first voicemail I listened to all the way through. His voice was clipped, controlled. That usually meant anger he believed was justified. He said I was being reckless. He said timing matters in transactions. He said he had spent 30 years building something, and I was choosing a personal grievance as the moment to create instability. Then he said the sentence that made me stop the recording and document the time. "You know, none of this works cleanly without you." I listened to it again. "None of this works cleanly without you." There it was. More honest than praise, more honest than apology, more honest than anything he had said to me in public in years. Not thank you, not we were wrong, not you mattered. Just a complaint shaped around a confession. At 3:05, I added the voicemail transcript to my file. At 3:19, Lydia called again. I read the line to her. She exhaled once and said, "That is dependence, not appreciation. Keep the distinction clear." I wrote that down too. That afternoon, I also learned something else. Paula, the Asheville manager, sent a short follow-up email at 3:43. She apologized for contacting me earlier and added one sentence at the end. "For what it's worth, everyone here assumed you were the one keeping central records aligned." Everyone here assumed, not just the family, not just me. Inside the actual business, the people closest to the operational truth had already understood my role more accurately than the people performing leadership at the top. That mattered more to me than I expected, because it meant I had not imagined the scale of it. I had not exaggerated. I had simply been living too close to a distortion field built by people who needed my work minimized in public so they could keep claiming ownership of the stability it created. By late afternoon, the transactional impact was already beginning. At 4:12, Daniel emailed again. The lending group was pausing final packaging review pending clarification of internal governance representations and documentation ownership. Neutral language. Serious consequence. At 4:38, a broker I had met only once sent a cautious note asking who now served as primary support for compliance-sensitive file consistency across the facilities. I did not answer that one directly. I forwarded it to my father and Cole and replied to the broker only that I was not an authorized representative and could not designate internal contacts on the company's behalf. That is the thing about professional withdrawal when done correctly. It creates clean edges. People cannot force you back into a role if you stop leaving them blurred places to stand. Around 5:20, I finally left my apartment and drove to a grocery store because I had almost no food and had not been outside all day. I remember standing in the produce section, holding a bag of spinach, and realizing I felt strangely lighter. Not happy, not triumphant, just less bent. For years, every family interaction had carried hidden operational risk underneath it. Every dinner, every holiday, every small favor, every gentle request from Denise, every breezy confidence from Cole, every irritated message from my father had been attached to the possibility that if I did not help, some structure would fail and I would be blamed for letting it. That day, for the first time, failure sat where it belonged, with the people claiming authority. When I got back to my apartment at 6:14, there were 36 missed calls total on my phone since morning. I documented the count. Then I listened to one voicemail from Cole left at 5:52. His voice had changed, less arrogant, more exposed. He said the lender was asking questions he could not answer. He said 2 site managers were overreacting. He said Dad was furious. Then he said, "Can you just tell me what you used to say when people asked about record control?" I sat at my kitchen table and almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was exact. That was my family in one request. He did not ask how to build actual control. He asked for the words I used when outsiders needed reassurance. Language, not structure. Cover, not repair. I did not call him back. Instead, I opened a new note and wrote, "Cole requested language, not systems, 5:52 p.m. Then I closed the file and made dinner. That night, around 8:08, Lydia sent me a draft of what she called a clean perimeter note, a short document for my records summarizing that I had repeatedly declined formal internal role assignment, had withdrawn all informal support in writing, and had corrected third-party reliance promptly upon learning my name was being used in active deal-related descriptions. I signed and dated my copy. She kept hers. At 8:31, Denise sent one final message for the day. "I think you're forgetting everything this family has done for you." I looked at it for a long time. Then I thought about the years I had spent cleaning files at midnight after my real workday ended. the dinner introductions, the unpaid weekends, the copied language, the missing titles, the voicemail from my father saying none of it worked cleanly without me, and I understood something clearly enough that I wish I had understood it at 28. Being used consistently can start to resemble being valued if no one ever says the quiet part out loud. But once the quiet part is spoken, even once, you cannot unknow it. My father had built a business image. Cole had built a future narrative. Denise had built a social cover around both of them. And I had built the paper trail that made the whole thing look steadier than it was. That was my real professional role. Not helper, not anxious daughter, not organized one. I was the private control system inside a family enterprise that wanted the protection of expertise without the discipline of respecting it. And now that I was gone, the holes were no longer theoretical. They were dated. They were time-stamped. They were being noticed by lenders, managers, and third parties. That night, at 9:17, my father sent one more email. No greeting, no apology, just one line. Be at the Greenville office tomorrow at 10. We need to clean this up internally. I read it once, then again. Then I forwarded it to Lydia. She wrote back 4 minutes later. Do not go alone, and do not go as their fixer. I knew then that the next step was not going to be another round of family pressure at a dining table. It was going to be something more dangerous. Because once people lose invisible support, they do not immediately become honest. First, they try to get the support back. And by the time I went to bed that night, I knew exactly what they were about to do. I did not go to the Greenville office at 10 o'clock the next morning. At 9:12, I sent a written reply stating that I was willing to attend a meeting only if the purpose was clearly defined in advance, outside counsel was permitted to join, and the discussion was limited to clarifying my withdrawal and any correction needed regarding prior use of my name. I added one more line. I would not participate in undocumented verbal planning, transition work, or internal role discussions. Then I sent it and closed my inbox for 11 minutes just to hear my own thoughts again. At 9:26, my father replied. He said counsel was unnecessary, I was being theatrical, and the family needed to handle sensitive matters privately before outsiders built the wrong picture. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. He was not trying to understand the picture. He was trying to manage who got to see it first. At 9:31, Lydia called and asked me to read the email aloud. When I finished, she was quiet for a second and then said, Do not enter any room where they intend to redefine facts before they are written down. So I did not. At 9:38, I answered my father in one paragraph. I wrote that I would not attend any meeting that excluded counsel, lacked written scope, or sought informal resolution of documented third-party reliance issues. If the family wanted to propose next steps, they could do so by email. That was the moment the tone changed for real. Up to then, they had still been acting as if I might bend out of habit. They thought enough pressure, enough irritation, enough guilt, enough urgency might push me back into the familiar position where I cleaned, softened, corrected, and protected. When I kept everything in writing, I took away their favorite tool, momentum. Families like mine depend on motion. Quick calls, hallway conversations, emotional timing, public warmth followed by private pressure. They get you agreeing before you have time to name what was asked. Writing slows that down. Writing makes people choose words. Writing remembers. At 9:52, Cole called twice. At 9:58, Denise called once. At 10:03, my father sent another message with the subject line, Final chance to resolve this as family. I did not answer immediately. I documented the time. Then I went back to the list I had built the day before and started doing the work that mattered most, identifying every place my name, language, or document structure might still be embedded in active operations. This was not revenge. It was perimeter control. If I left anything vague, they would use the vagueness. So I pulled up old draft folders, archived email chains, file version histories, shared trackers, and attachment logs. I checked not just whether I had withdrawn, but whether my withdrawal had actually removed my fingerprints from places where outsiders might still assume current involvement. This was not revenge. It was perimeter control. By 10:41, I had a second list. Documents likely still carrying my language. Role descriptions that might imply active support. Response templates copied from prior drafts. Renewal calendars built on my structure. Third-party contacts that might still default to me. Shared folders using my naming conventions. It was longer than I wanted it to be. That was the real danger of invisible work. People do not just use you in the moment. They keep using your systems after they stop acknowledging where those systems came from. At 11:08, Paula sent another note, this time shorter. Cole is asking staff to say central documentation is being updated. We still do not know who owns what. I read that once, then again. We still do not know who owns what. That sentence sat in my chest harder than I expected, because ownership had always been the core lie in my family. My father wanted ownership of outcomes. Cole wanted ownership of authority. Denise wanted ownership of the public story. And I had been left owning responsibility without recognition. At 11:16, I replied to Paula very carefully. I said I could not advise on internal management decisions and could not clarify role ownership on behalf of the business. I also said that any documents, trackers, or procedures previously associated with my informal support should now be treated as unsupported unless formally reassigned and reviewed internally. Unsupported. It was the right word. Cold, but accurate. Lydia approved that wording 7 minutes later. At 11:34, Daniel from the lending group emailed again. The underwriting team needed written clarification by end of day regarding who currently oversaw record consistency, renewal tracking, and compliance-sensitive document maintenance across the facilities. Not who intended to, not who hoped to, who currently did. I forwarded the request to my father and Cole with one line, "Please respond directly. I am not authorized to answer on behalf of the business." At 11:49, Cole wrote back privately, "What do they even mean by record consistency?" I stared at that message so long my coffee went cold, because there it was again, not malicious, not loud, almost worse than that, empty. He had been introduced for years as the future of the business. He had sat in meetings, shaken hands, taken credit for expansion plans, spoken confidently to vendors and lenders, and allowed our father to present him as the next operator. And he did not know what they meant by record consistency. I did not answer him. Instead, I copied the message into my notes. 11:49 a.m., Cole asked, "What do they even mean by record consistency?" That was not a personal victory. It was operational proof. The rest of that afternoon became a study in quiet withdrawal. I stopped anticipating needs. I stopped filling gaps before anyone named them. I stopped translating vague requests into professional action. I stopped doing the internal mental work that had once made their confusion look like competence from the outside. At 12:22, Denise sent a message saying, "Everyone is escalating because you keep using technical language." That one almost made me smile. Technical language. As if the problem were vocabulary. As if underwriting questions existed because I used accurate words, not because the underlying structure had been resting on informal labor no one wanted to define. At 12:47, Lydia suggested one more protective step. She told me to send a formal written withdrawal notice to the holding company's general legal contact, not because I owed them help, but because it closed another possible gap. If anyone later claimed confusion about my status, there would be no honest basis for it. So at 1:06 p.m., I did exactly that. The notice was plain. I stated that I had never accepted a formal internal compliance, governance, or documentation management role with Ellison Imaging Holdings or any related operating entity. I stated that any historical assistance I provided had been informal and limited. I stated that effective 11:06 p.m. on December 11, 2025, I had withdrawn from all such support. I stated that my name, credentials, email, prior drafts, and historical involvement should not be cited to imply continuing role authority, reliance, control, transition support, or current operational oversight. I sent it, saved the delivery receipt, added it to the withdrawal record. Then I stood up, walked to my kitchen, and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, from the effort of doing something final. People talk about boundaries like they are emotional lines. Sometimes they are procedural endings. Sometimes they are document language. Sometimes they are the decision to stop lending your competence to people who will absolutely use it and absolutely minimize it in the same week. At 1:38, my father left another voicemail, short this time. You are creating liability where there wasn't any. I played it twice. That silence afterward told me more than the sentence itself. Because if there had truly been no problem, my withdrawal would have been inconvenient, not destabilizing. The panic proved the dependence. The irritation proved the entitlement. At 2:04, an operations coordinator I barely knew sent an email intended for someone else and accidentally copied me. It said, "Do we have any actual assigned owner for the credentialing, licensing, and policy version items Mara had been handling? Any actual assigned owner." I should not have been on that email, but I was glad I saw it before they corrected the mistake. Not because it pleased me, because it confirmed the shape of the truth. There had never been an actual owner. There had been me. At 2:17, my father called again. I let it ring. Then he texted, "This is now affecting the board update." Board update. That was new. Ellison Imaging had a tiny advisory board, mostly older local investors, and 2 outside business contacts who liked to call themselves strategic. They were not deeply operational, but they mattered to my father because they witnessed legitimacy. If they started asking who had been handling what, he would not be able to answer with charm alone. I documented the text. At 2:44, Lydia asked whether I had any reason to believe my name had been referenced in board materials, lender notes, or external summaries beyond what Daniel had already disclosed. I answered honestly, I did not know, but I suspected my father had been speaking about me as a stabilizing background function for longer than anyone had ever admitted openly. She told me to stay ready for one question above all others. Was my name still being used after I withdrew? That question matters because it strips away intention games. It does not ask what people meant, it asks what they did. At 3:02, Denise finally changed tactics. She sent a long message about my late mother. My late mother was not part of their business. She had died when I was 19, years before Denise married my father. Denise rarely invoked her unless she wanted moral leverage. This time, she wrote that my mother would have wanted unity and that I was hurting your father at a time when family legacy matters. I read it and felt nothing except clarity. That was when I knew I was done in a way deeper than paperwork. Because once people start borrowing the dead to pressure the living, they are out of real arguments. I did not answer. At 3:41, Daniel emailed one final time that day. Underwriting had paused the file pending revised internal role descriptions and confirmation of who held present responsibility for documentation governance at the entity level. Present responsibility. Again, that word. Present. Not family history, not assumptions, not background reassurance, not Mara usually helps. Actual responsibility, currently held by someone the business was willing to name. By 4:10, my father's messages had shifted from anger to negotiation. He wrote that perhaps the family could structure a short-term consulting understanding just to get through year-end. He said compensation could be discussed. He said maybe titles had been handled too casually. He even said, "I know you've done more than we gave you credit for." I read that line once, then again, not because it moved me, because it was the first real sentence he had written in years. "I know you've done more than we gave you credit for." Too late is not the same thing as untrue. He meant it. I think that much is fair. He just meant it only after the consequences reached him. I sent the email to Lydia. She wrote back, "Do not confuse acknowledgement under pressure with repair." So I did not. At 4:36, I replied to my father with the calmest no I have ever written. I stated that I would not enter any short-term, transitional, or emergency consulting arrangement. I stated that past informality was exactly what had created the current problem. I stated that any future professional engagement, if ever considered, would require independent terms, separate counsel review, defined scope, and complete correction of prior role misstatements first. Then I added the line that mattered most. Please confirm in writing whether my name was used in any board, lender, broker, or transaction-related material after my withdrawal notice was sent. I sent it at 4:39 p.m. That question sat unanswered for 51 minutes. At 5:30, Cole called. At 5:33, Denise called. At 5:37, my father emailed back with only 2 sentences. Your name may have remained in some circulating materials generated before your message was fully processed. No one intended misuse. May have remained. Generated before your message was fully processed. I documented the exact wording immediately, because that was the first near admission. Not clean enough to be honest, not vague enough to deny later. At 6:04, Lydia called and asked me to read it aloud. When I finished, she said very calmly, "That is why you withdrew in writing." Then she told me something else. There was a holiday donor reception the next evening at one of the Greenville facilities. My father had mentioned it casually months earlier when talking about year-end visibility. If the lender, pause, board questions, and internal confusion had already started reaching the surface, there was a strong chance the family would try to act normal in public before the narrative hardened around them. She did not tell me to go. She asked whether I thought my father would keep performing stability while trying to pull me back in privately. I said yes. She said, "Then if you appear anywhere, appear with facts, not emotion." That became my plan. Not revenge, not exposure for entertainment, just one clean public moment if it became necessary. That evening, I printed everything. The November 18th email asking for formalization, my father's "Don't make this weird," the 11:06 p.m. withdrawal notice, delivery confirmations, the lender clarification request, the line about family side compliance administration, Cole's question about record consistency, my father's voicemail transcript, "You know none of this works cleanly without you." The email admitting my name may have remained in circulating materials after withdrawal. The perimeter note Lydia helped me prepare. I placed them in a dark gray folder and set it on my dining table. Then I made a second copy, not because I was dramatic, because good records should survive one bad room. At 8:12, Paula sent a final message for the day. It was only one sentence. "I think they assumed you would come back before anyone noticed." I sat there with the folder in front of me and let that sentence settle. Because it was true. That had been the system for years. They delayed, I repaired. They minimized, I stayed. They leaned harder, I absorbed more. They assumed the pattern was permanent because it had always worked before. What none of them understood was that quiet people do not stay quiet because they lack a line. Often, they stay quiet because they are measuring exactly where it is. By the time I went to bed that night, the line had already been crossed, documented, printed, and dated. The next step was not another private argument. It was letting them feel what my absence looked like in a room full of witnesses. The donor reception started at 6:30 the next evening at the Greenville Imaging Center. I arrived at 6:47, not early enough to help, not late enough to look theatrical, just on time to see what they thought they could still carry. I parked across the lot, sat in my car for a minute, and documented the time. Then I picked up the gray folder from the passenger seat, locked the car, and walked in through the side entrance used by staff. The reception area had been dressed the way Denise liked things dressed. White tablecloths, warm lighting, branded signage, catered food arranged in careful little arcs to suggest order and generosity. My father stood near the registration desk with the practiced expression he used at public events: calm mouth, open shoulders, voice a little louder than necessary. Cole was at his side in a navy jacket, speaking to two local business owners like nothing under him had shifted in the last 36 hours. From a distance, the room looked stable. That was always their skill, not building stability, photographing it. I checked in with the receptionist, who looked relieved and confused at the same time when she saw me. That told me more than I needed to know. My presence still read as operational reassurance in that building, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. Paula saw me first. She crossed the room, stopped at a respectful distance, and said quietly, "They're telling people everything is under control." I nodded once. I assumed so. She glanced at the folder in my hand and then back at me. "Good." That was all she said. It was enough. At 6:56, one of the advisory board members, Frank Delaney, approached me near the coffee station. Frank was in his late 60s, precise and usually more observant than he pretended to be. He smiled and said, "Mara, I hear your father has you cleaning up year-end files again." Again. That word landed cleanly, because it meant my father had been speaking about me as a known stabilizing function for long enough that board-level people considered it routine. I let him finish before answering. Then I said, "Actually, Frank, I withdrew from all support Thursday night in writing." He blinked once. "Did you?" "Yes. I kept my voice level. No performance, no invitation to gossip. Just a fact placed where a false assumption had been." Frank's expression changed in a small but important way. Not shock. Recalculation. That is what truth does in rooms built on soft misdirection. It makes people start rearranging what they thought they knew. At 7:03, my father saw me speaking to Frank and came over immediately. He had a smile on his face, but his eyes were wrong. Too fixed. Too fast. "Mara," he said, "good. I was hoping you'd come by so we could clear up a few things." I said, "I'm sure." Frank looked between us and stepped back without leaving, also useful. My father lowered his voice. "This is not the place." I answered quietly, "Then it shouldn't have followed me here." He understood what I meant. So did Frank, because if my name had not been used in lender conversations, board assumptions, and internal descriptions, there would have been nothing to clear up in a public room. Cole joined us 20 seconds later. Denise came after that, smiling the way people smile when they are trying to keep other people from noticing that the floor has changed underneath them. Denise said, "Mara, sweetheart, let's not do business talk during a donor evening." I looked at her. "Then your family shouldn't have used my role as business cover." That was the first sentence in the room that made the air change, not because I raised my voice, because I did not. A nearby couple stopped pretending not to hear. Frank did not move. Paula, across the room, looked down at her clipboard and stayed exactly where she was. My father gave a short laugh that had no ease in it. "No one used anything. There's been some confusion about language." I opened the folder. Not fast, not dramatically, just enough to remove one printed page. Then I handed it to him. It was his own email from the previous day, the one saying my name may have remained in circulating materials generated after my withdrawal notice had been sent. He looked at the page and did not touch it for a second. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. Frank held out his hand. "May I?" I passed him the second copy. My father's face changed when he realized I had brought duplicates. Not because he thought I would scream, because he had expected I would still protect the room by keeping proof in my bag. I had done that for years. Bring the truth, keep it covered, correct quietly later. Never make the structure visible while other people were watching. Not this time. Frank read the page once, then again. His mouth flattened. He looked at my father and said, "Warren, what exactly was Mara's role?" That was the question. Not emotional, not theatrical, not personal. What exactly was Mara's role? My father answered too quickly, which meant he knew there was no good answer. She helped with documents here and there. I took out a second sheet and handed it to Frank. This one was my withdrawal notice, dated and time-stamped. Then I said, "If I helped here and there, why did underwriting pause after I clarified I was gone?" You could feel the room narrow. Cole stepped in then, voice low and irritated. "Because you made it sound like the entire place was unsupported." I turned to him. Was it supported? He opened his mouth, then closed it. That silence told the room what my words no longer needed to. Frank looked from Cole to me, then back to my father. Was she being presented as part of control infrastructure? My father said, "That's an exaggeration." I pulled out one more page, the note from Daniel's call. The phrase Family Side Compliance Administration, with my name referenced as a stabilizing factor. Frank read that too. I did not need to say much after that. The documents were doing what documents do. They were holding still in a room full of people who wanted movement, tone, forgiveness, and soft language. Across the room, 2 donors had stopped near the display wall and were now very carefully not looking at us, while clearly listening. Denise noticed. Of course she did. Her entire life ran on noticing who might carry a story out of a room. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Mara, this is becoming inappropriate." I said, "What part? The documents or the witnesses?" That was the first moment her composure slipped. Not much, just enough. She drew in a breath and said, "You are embarrassing your father." I looked at her and answered with the truest thing available. "No, I stopped covering for him." Frank glanced at me, then at the pages again. "Warren, were board members told Mara was maintaining governance support?" My father did not answer directly. He started talking around the edges, about family support, transitional periods, informal help, miscommunication, timing. The usual language people use when they hope one cloud of soft words can blur a line already written in ink. It could not, because every time he softened, I could answer with something dated. November 18th, my written request to formalize scope. 11:06 p.m. Thursday. Withdrawal notice. 9:02 a.m. Friday. Lender clarification call. 4:39 p.m. Friday. My written request asking whether my name remained in materials after withdrawal. 5:37 p.m. His written answer that it may have remained. No speeches, just sequence. At 7:19, one of the business owners Cole had been talking to drifted closer. Then one of the board's outside contacts. Then, unexpectedly, Brent Harlow, a local attorney who advised smaller healthcare groups and sometimes hovered near my father when deals were in progress. He had not been copied on my withdrawal records, but he had clearly heard enough already to understand something serious had surfaced. He asked the room, very evenly, was there active reliance on her status or not? That is the kind of question adults ask when performance time is over. My father said, "Not in the way this is being framed." I let him finish. Then I handed Brent the page with Daniel's wording and my correction. He read it for about 12 seconds and said nothing. Those 12 seconds were some of the loudest of my life, because once a lawyer stops speaking, everyone starts hearing structure instead of spin. Cole looked at me with open frustration now, not polished annoyance, real panic beginning to show through. He said, "So, what do you want?" That question told the room more about him than anything else he could have said, because he still thought this was leverage, still thought every boundary eventually declared its price. I answered, "Nothing. I already withdrew." And that was the truth. I did not want money that night. I did not want apologies performed under fluorescent lighting. I did not want them dragged. I wanted the room to understand that I had not stormed out of a family disagreement. I had removed myself from an operational fiction that had been using my name as a support beam. Frank handed the papers back to me very carefully. Then he said, "Warren, I think you need to suspend all representations tied to Mara immediately and issue corrected descriptions before this goes any further." Before this goes any further. There it was. Not my sentence, someone else's. My father knew then that the room was gone. Not destroyed. Worse than that. Reclassified. He said my name sharply, the way he used to when I was younger, and he still believed tone alone could put me back in position. "Mara, office, now." I looked at him. No. One word, flat, public, final. That one word did more than any long confrontation could have done, because it broke the old sequence. He summons, I follow. He pressures, I explain. He reframes, I soften. He gets the structure back. No. Frank cleared his throat. If there's going to be a conversation, it should probably include counsel at this point. My father hated being corrected by men his own age. You could see it all over him. But he could not fight that room the way he fought me, not with witnesses, not with documents already in other hands. Denise tried once more to salvage tone. She smiled at the nearest donors and said, "Family businesses are always a little complicated." One of the donors, a woman named Jeanette, who had served on a nonprofit board with Denise, said quietly, "Complicated is not the same as undocumented." I will probably remember that sentence for the rest of my life, because it was clean, and because it came from someone outside the family performance circle, a witness with no reason to flatter me and no incentive to protect them. That was when Cole made his mistake. He said, too quickly and too loudly, "Fine, she did the paperwork. We can replace paperwork." The silence after that was immediate, not because anyone believed him, because everyone in that area now understood the contempt and the dependence were real at the same time. Frank turned to him and said, "Then why are lenders pausing?" Cole had no answer. None. He looked at my father, then at Brent, then at the floor. And in that small chain of glances, years of public confidence finally showed its wiring. At 7:31, Paula approached with a clipboard and said in the voice competent people use when they are done pretending confusion is leadership, "Morin, the site reviewers sent a new request. They need confirmation tonight on document ownership and current oversight contact. Who would you like listed?" No one spoke. That question hung in the center of the room with nowhere to go. Who would you like listed? Not who sounds impressive. Not who used to cover this. Not who can be implied. Who, specifically, now. That was the system collapse in its cleanest form. Not a bankruptcy, not a shouting match. A blank line where a real structure should have been. My father finally said, "We'll handle it internally." Paula, to her credit, did not move. They asked for a named contact. That silence was the end of the performance, because there are moments when image fails all at once. Not loudly, not with broken glass, just with one practical question no one in charge can answer, while the person who used to save them is standing 3 feet away, no longer saving them. I looked at Paula and said, "Please do not list me." She nodded once. Understood. My father closed his eyes for half a second, long enough that everyone saw it, long enough that I knew he understood what had finally happened. This was no longer a family disagreement he could smooth over after the guests left. It was now visible to board members, donors, site staff, and outside professionals that the business had relied on an undefined support structure built around someone it refused to recognize formally. And I had not exposed that by attacking. I had exposed it by refusing one final time to stand in the gap. At 7:38, I put the documents back into the gray folder. Then I looked at my father, then at Cole, then at Denise, and said, "Any further discussion can happen with counsel present and in writing." No one stopped me when I turned to leave. Not because they were calm, because witnesses had done what witnesses do when truth reaches a certain density. They made it impossible to pull me back into a private version of events. As I walked toward the exit, Paula said quietly, "For what it's worth, I'm glad someone finally said it plainly." I nodded and kept walking. Outside, the air was cold enough to clear my head. I reached my car at 7:44 and documented the time before I started the engine. Then I sat there for a full minute with my hands on the steering wheel and realized I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. There is a difference. Victory still looks back. Finished faces forward. At 8:02, while I was stopped at a red light halfway home, my phone buzzed with an email from my father. Subject line, "Tomorrow, 11 a.m., conference room, counsel included." I read it once at the next light, then again when I got home. After years of family conversations built on tone, pressure, implication, and private debt, we were finally going to sit at a table with paper between us. That was the only kind of meeting I had ever wanted, and by then I knew they were walking into it weaker than they understood. The meeting started at 11:03 the next morning in a conference room above the Greenville Administrative Suite. I arrived at 10:52 with Lydia. That detail mattered to me, not because I wanted them to see I had brought someone, because for once I wanted to enter a family room on time, prepared, and not alone. The conference room was exactly what you would expect from a business trying hard to look settled. Beige walls, framed expansion photos, a table too large for the amount of honest work usually done around it, a speakerphone in the center, bottled water lined up as if neatness could substitute for structure. My father was already there, sitting at the far end. Cole was on his right. Denise sat beside him with a legal pad she was not really using. Brent Harlow, the local attorney from the donor reception, was there too, not as my counsel and not fully as theirs either. More like a person who had recognized a preventable problem too late and now wanted the facts on record. Lydia took the chair beside me. She placed her folder on the table and said good morning in the same tone she might use for a zoning dispute or contract cleanup. Neutral, controlled, not interested in anyone's family mythology. That helped more than I can explain. No one offered small talk. My father began the way people like him always begin when public certainty has failed them. He tried to move backward into vagueness. He said there had been a breakdown in communication. He said everyone was tired at year-end. He said family members had different understandings of my role. He said the donor reception had, unfortunately, created optics. Optics. I let him finish. Then Lydia said, "This meeting should stay focused on documented facts, prior role descriptions, post-withdrawal use of Miss Ellison's name, and any corrective action the company intends to take." That sentence changed the room immediately, because she had taken away the one thing my family always used best, atmosphere. My father looked at me, not Lydia, me. He said, "Mara, no one was trying to exploit you." I opened my folder and placed 4 papers on the table between us. The November 18th email, where I asked for scope, authority, and compensation. His reply telling me not to make it weird. My 11:06 p.m. withdrawal notice. His email stating my name may have remained in circulating materials after that withdrawal. Then I said, "I'm not asking what you intended. I'm looking at what happened." That was the first honest sentence in the room. Cole shifted in his chair and said, "You're acting like we built the entire business on your back." I turned to him and answered the same way I had answered everything important that week, calmly, precisely. "No, I'm saying you built part of its credibility on my undocumented labor." That shut him up for a moment. Brandt asked whether everyone agreed that my role had never been formalized internally. My father said yes. Denise said yes more quietly. Cole stared at the table and nodded once. Then Lydia asked the next question. "Do you also agree that Miss Ellison's name and historical involvement were used in current deal-related or governance-related descriptions beyond what her actual role supported?" That question sat in the room longer than the others, because this was where family feelings stopped mattering and accountability started. My father tried to soften again. He said, "My name may have been referenced as someone familiar with documentation history." Brent asked whether that was all. Frankly, no one in the room believed it anymore. Not after the lender call, not after the board assumptions, not after the donor reception. So I placed the note from Daniel's clarifying call on the table. Family Side Compliance Administration. My name referenced as a stabilizing factor. Brent read it, then read it again. Denise finally spoke in a voice that sounded smaller than I had ever heard from her. She said, "It wasn't supposed to mean anything formal." That silence after her sentence told me more than the sentence itself, because that was the whole structure of my place in that family. Nothing formal, everything relied upon. Lydia asked whether any board members had been given similar impressions. My father said some people may have made assumptions over time based on how often I helped. Then Brent asked the question that mattered most. After her written withdrawal, was Miss Ellison's name left in any materials, summaries, role descriptions, or active representations without her consent? No one answered right away. I documented the time on the top corner of my notepad, 11:21 a.m. Then my father said yes, not elegantly, not fully, but clearly enough. He said yes, some materials had not been updated quickly enough. Yes, some internal descriptions were still circulating. Yes, people may have continued speaking as if I were available while they tried to work through transition. There it was. Not apology, not repair, admission. I did not react. I just placed one more paper on the table. My note from the Asheville manager asking who should be sending the response now. Then the accidental copy asking whether there was any actual assigned owner for the credentialing, licensing, and policy version items Mara had been handling. Brent looked up from the pages and asked, "Was there any actual reassignment plan when she withdrew?" No one answered because there was no answer. My father rubbed one hand over his jaw. Cole looked openly angry again, but now it was the anger of a person cornered by specifics rather than the confidence of someone expecting me to fold. Finally, Cole said, "We thought she would at least help through the immediate pressure." I looked at him. That was the entire problem. And for the first time in that room, no one tried to argue with me, because they all knew it was true. They had always assumed I would help through the immediate pressure, then the next one, then the next quarter, then the next missing file, then the next deal, then the next public dinner. They had built years of decisions around the expectation that I would step in before consequences reached them fully. Lydia asked them what corrective action they intended to take now. Not emotionally, procedurally. Brent answered first. He said the company needed immediate written correction of all active lender and board-facing role descriptions, reassignment of document ownership, formal designation of present oversight contacts, and a review of where historical support language had been used imprecisely. Then he added, carefully, that no future references to my role should be made without written consent. I appreciated that he said it before anyone else did. My father nodded like it was his own idea. That is one thing men like him do, even when they are losing control. They reach for ownership of the fix so they do not have to sit too long with ownership of the failure. Then came the part Juan had known was coming from the moment I agreed to attend, the rewrite attempt. Denise leaned forward and said, "I think we all need to acknowledge that Mara has always been deeply attached to the business, and sometimes that made boundaries unclear on both sides." On both sides, I almost smiled, because there it was again, the family instinct to divide accountability evenly the moment paper starts pointing in only one direction. I opened my folder and slid forward a clean printed timeline, specific dates, specific requests, specific unpaid interventions, specific written attempts to formalize, specific withdrawals, specific continued uses after withdrawal. Then I said, "My boundary was unclear because you benefited from it being unclear." No one interrupted me, so I kept going. I asked for scope. I asked for structure. I asked not to be represented in ways that weren't accurate. When that was ignored, I withdrew. You continued using my name after that. This is not a misunderstanding on both sides. It is a long pattern on one side that I finally stopped carrying. That was the closest thing to a speech I gave all week. Even then, it was short. Brent nodded once. Lydia said nothing. She did not need to. The documents were speaking now. My father looked older than he had at the donor reception. Not broken, just forced into a shape he had been avoiding for years. He said, "What exactly are you saying you will no longer provide?" I had expected that question, so I answered from a page I had already prepared. I said I would no longer provide informal support of any kind relating to licensing calendars, credentialing rosters, document governance, audit response language, policy maintenance, training records, transaction preparation, lender clarification, board-facing summaries, or operational cleanup for any Ellison imaging entity. I said I would not review drafts, I would not take calls during emergencies. I would not advise site managers privately. I would not translate vague business requests into regulatory language. I would not be listed as background support, historical continuity, transition assistance, family side oversight, or any similar phrase. Then I added one more line. If you want expertise, hire it. If you want family, stop confusing it with labor you don't have to respect. No one had an answer to that either. And that was when my father finally said something real. Not enough, but real. He said, "I did rely on you more than I admitted." That sentence sat in the room for several seconds. I had wanted those words for years, I think, or some version of them. But when they finally came, they did not change much, because timing matters. A true sentence said after collapse does not undo the years built before it. Still, I nodded once. Not forgiveness, just receipt. Cole never apologized. That is also part of the truth. He said the business was under pressure and that I knew how much was at stake. In his mind, scale still excused extraction. Denise said she wished things had been handled with less hardness. That was her last attempt to make the wound about my tone instead of their use. By 12:06, the meeting was effectively over. Corrective steps had been named, admissions had been made, my non-role had been defined. The old family arrangement had finally been denied oxygen in a room where everyone heard it happen. I gathered my papers slowly, not to create drama, to make sure I left with every copy I brought. Then I stood up. My father looked at me and said, "So that's it?" That question carried years in it, not just the week, not just the deal. "So that's it? As in, you're really not coming back to fix this? You're really going to let us feel the full shape of what you used to absorb? You're really choosing a life where our urgency does not automatically become your responsibility?" I looked at him and answered the way I should have years earlier. "Yes." Then Lydia and I walked out. No slam door, no tears, no collapse in the hallway. Just the end of an arrangement that had survived too long on my silence. The consequences came slowly, which is how real consequences usually come. The refinancing package did not go through that quarter. It was not one dramatic explosion. It stalled, narrowed, got repriced, and then eventually restructured under terms less favorable than my father had been pursuing. Investors asked more questions. The advisory board became less decorative. Site managers started pushing for clearer ownership lines because they were tired of answering for confusion from above. 2 facilities brought in outside regulatory support within 3 months, not because my father suddenly respected the field, but because chaos is expensive when no daughter is quietly reducing it at midnight. Cole struggled. That is the kindest, honest way to say it. He was finally forced to describe processes he had spent years speaking around. He disliked that intensely. A person can coast on authority for a long time when someone else is maintaining the floor underneath him. He found out what happens when the floor stops arriving early. Denise stayed socially polished, but I heard through local channels that some invitations grew less warm for a while, not because anyone hated her, because rooms remember when presentation and substance split in public. As for me, the strangest part was how quiet my life became. Not empty, quiet. My evenings were mine, my weekends were mine. No sudden site panic, no late-night file rescue, no carefully worded texts from Denise, no quick question from Cole that turned into 3 unpaid hours, no fatherly irritation when I requested definitions for work everyone already assumed I owed. I had not realized how much of my nervous system had been arranged around anticipated interruption until the interruption stopped. About 8 months later, I closed on a townhouse in Asheville. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, small back patio, a desk by the window where I could work without feeling borrowed. I remember signing the final papers and feeling something very clean settle inside me. Not triumphs, relief with structure, earned privacy, space purchased not just with money, but with the refusal to keep financing other people's disorder with my time. I also did one thing I am still glad I did. My father's older sister, my Aunt Helen, had always been the quiet one in our family, the one people overlooked because she did not perform importance. After a fall that winter, she needed help sorting insurance paperwork and home care coordination. She did not ask through my father. She called me directly and said, very simply, "I need help understanding these forms, and if you can't, I understand." That sentence mattered. If you can't, I understand. No entitlement, no inherited claim. No assumption that my competence belonged to the family account. So I helped her, separately, directly, on my terms. I reviewed the paperwork, helped her compare care options, and connected her with a local elder services coordinator who was actually equipped to support her longer term. It took 2 afternoons and 1 follow-up call. She thanked me twice and sent me home with soup in reusable containers I still have. That, to me, is what family should feel like. Not extraction, not role confusion, not permanent access to the strongest person in the room, just care with consent. My father and I did not reconcile in any cinematic way. Over time, the messages became less charged, then more occasional, then careful. He once asked if we could have lunch. We did. It was civil. He mentioned the townhouse. I mentioned Aunt Helen. He did not ask for help with the business. I noticed that. It was the first respectful thing he had done in a long time. Cole stayed distant. Denise stayed gracious in the public way people do when they have decided not to revisit the facts. That was fine with me. Not every closed door has to be reopened to prove healing. Some doors just stop needing to be walked through. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that usefulness is a bad thing. Usefulness is good. Competence is good. Helping people you love is good. What breaks you is when your usefulness becomes the only proof anyone thinks you owe them. That is not love. That is dependency with better manners. And boundaries are expensive. They cost comfort. They cost image. They cost access to old versions of yourself that other people preferred because those versions never sent invoices, never asked for definitions, and never said no in writing. But they buy something better. They buy accuracy. They buy sleep. They buy the right to let adults carry their own weight. They buy a life where your calm is no longer confused with endless availability. I still keep good records. That part of me did not change. But now the records belong to my work, my home, my clients, my life, not to a family system that treated my protection like property. If you're listening and you've ever been the person everyone called when things went wrong while pretending your work was no big deal when things were going right, I want you to remember this. Being needed is not the same as being valued. And the moment you learn the difference, everything starts to sort itself faster than people expect. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments what hit hardest: the lender call, the donor reception, the printed timeline on the table, or the sentence my father finally said when it was too late to keep pretending. Then subscribe if you want more stories like this one.